Which brings us to point 8. And I'm very happy to be able to welcome here the new American ambassador. This is Mr. Gardner. I don't think there's any need for great introductions here. It's here, and we've just been talking with the Italian presidency about this. There are economic relations with the United States which we definitely need to have. Of course, we have to talk about TTIP with particular attention, particularly as regards the most recent negotiations and the desire for the greatest possible degree of transparency, and the question of how you assess progress after November, when the ISDS consultation results reach us and the United States has held congressional elections. At that stage, we're going to need to see what the future prospects for the negotiations are. We're happy to see the ambassador here right at the beginning of his term of office, and I'll give him the floor now.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your invitation to appear before this committee. This is my first appearance before a committee of the European Parliament. When I arrived in Brussels in March, you were already in election mode. I'm pleased that the Parliament is now in full operation and that we can begin what I hope will be a long and fruitful dialogue. I appreciate the critical role that this institution plays, the steady expansion of its powers with every European treaty, including the Lisbon Treaty, has been an important contribution to reinforcing the democratic legitimacy of the EU institutions. In my first appearance before the U.S. Senate during my hearings, I specifically referenced my strong desire for good relations with the European Parliament, and in my first policy speech, shortly after I arrived, I listed this desire as one of my 4 key priorities during the next 3 years. I know, of course, that the Parliament, and specifically this committee, will play an important role in determining whether TTIP negotiations succeed. I've had the opportunity to interact in the past with several members of this committee, including Commissioners Reding, whom I see here today, and Commissioner Wren. And as Commissioner Reding knows, concluding the negotiations on the Safe Harbor and Data Privacy and Protection Agreement is a top priority for me. I take data privacy issues very seriously indeed, and I am committed to restoring trust in transatlantic data flows. And I can tell you that I and the U.S.-EU mission played an important role in Attorney General Eric Holder's recent statement that the Obama administration will seek congressional legislation to extend to EU citizens the same rights that U.S. citizens have under the U.S. Privacy Act. I also see some other familiar faces. Maritja, it's good to see you again after a few months. And I know another member of this committee, Josef Zayer. I'm not sure he's here today, but we're old friends dating back to Columbia Law School. And I never forget a presentation he gave at that time where he predicted he would be a member of the first free parliament in Hungary, which he did in only 1 year. I notice also that Jaroslav Wałęsa is here. I had the great privilege of knowing his father when I was a student in the Jagiellonian University of Krakow in 1983, at the time when his father was under house arrest. And his father, I just say, sets an example for us all in the courage he had in challenging authoritarian rule. I've been involved in and have cared about EU issues for 23 years, first as a lawyer, then as a government official in the White House, and more recently as a banker and an investor working and living in Europe. Ever since my studies of EU policy and law at Oxford and Columbia Law School and my time as a stagiaire in the European Commission, I have been a believer in the European project. I believe it is good for Europe, and I believe it is good for the United States. Just as I believe in the United States, I believe in Europe's ability to compete and to win in international trade. Europe needs to believe in itself. Volevo dire anche un paio di parole ai miei amici italiani qui.
I wanted to say a couple of things to my Italian friends here. My mother comes from Venice, and I grew up proud of my Italian heritage. I lived in Rome during the years of lead, the so-called, and I've often returned to Italy for personal and professional reasons. And I also have in French links with France, and I want to say this to my French friends in French. I've spent time in Paris in a French-American law office, first of all in Paris and then in Brussels. In the National Security Council in the White House, I was in charge of relations with the European Union and with France. And in Spanish, I also have certain links with Spain. My father was American ambassador in Spain, and thanks to his period there, I met and married a Spaniard. And I've also had the opportunity to spend a long time in Germany. This is now in German. In summer 1978, I worked with Radio Free Europe in Munich, and in 1981, I was active in the American administration then.
And to fight for the interests of the United States. No surprises there. But I'm also a proud European. I've lived half my life and have spent nearly all my career in Europe. After my internship in the European Commission, I faced a critical decision about what to do with my career. Do I go back to the United States or do I stay in Europe? And unusually for a U.S.-trained lawyer, I decided to start my life here because of the single market program and the opening up of the EC to the East. It seemed like a historic time, and I wanted to be part of it. I feel the same sense of historic opportunity today due to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its continuing aggression in eastern Ukraine, which has manufactured a humanitarian crisis, the importance of further European integration and closer transatlantic cooperation is now more evident to me than ever. And the urgency of greater European defense spending, unified European energy policy, and also the transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement is now even more compelling. The transatlantic partnership has deepened at times of crisis like today. This time is no different. The only relevant question for us is, will we seize these opportunities? At a time when Russia is supplying troops and equipment to the separatists in the Ukraine and shares responsibility for the killing of European citizens in the skies above Ukraine, it would be appropriate to put peripheral issues such as chicken washed in chlorine into some perspective. We have the opportunity to interact, we will have the opportunity to interact a great deal over the next few years. I look forward to a regular, open, and honest dialogue. My door will always be open to the members of this committee and to the members of this Parliament. We will no doubt disagree on some matters, but I hope these disagreements will be about real, substantive issues, not peripheral issues that are getting so much attention in the media. I hope our disagreements will be based on an accurate interpretation of our respective policies and interests. We have a common responsibility to our electorates to lead and to inform. And this is particularly true regarding the single most important economic issue that we have in front of us, TTIP. No other issue comes close in terms of its potential to promote growth and jobs and to shape the rules on international trade. Understanding the technical issues at stake is difficult, it's time-consuming, but it is necessary. There are many compelling geopolitical and economic reasons to conclude an ambitious agreement. And I say ambitious because we continue to believe, like our Commission colleagues, that only a comprehensive agreement would yield the significant results our leaders want and at the same time provide the necessary balance. Yes, I know our friend Carlo Calenda, whom I just saw leaving this chamber, believes that an interim agreement should be considered, but we continue to believe that only a comprehensive agreement will work. We have an opportunity during the next few years to set a standard for future regional trade deals and global trade deals that reflect our shared support for rules-based trade, high standards and regulatory transparency and accountability. If we fail, other countries who do not share our standards, who do not share our values, and whose weight in the international trading system is growing fast will set those standards for us. TTIP's potential to promote growth and jobs, especially among small and medium-sized enterprises that are the backbone of our economies, fails to attract much attention in Europe, despite Europe's continuing sluggish economic performance. Both sides of the Atlantic need faster economic growth, but let's face it, Europe needs them even more. How is Europe going to provide its youth the future they want? How is Europe going to afford to pay a decent pension for its retirees and pay for the social protections it wants without this growth? While TTIP by itself is not a solution to the challenge of creating growth and jobs, it is the biggest debt-free stimulus available. Every serious academic study on both sides of the Atlantic concludes that the impact will be significantly positive. The United States remains fully committed to these negotiations and to an ambitious outcome. The midterm elections are not affecting our engagement. Yes, trade promotion authority is a critical tool for achieving necessary congressional support for an eventual agreement, but the absence of trade promotion authority is not an impediment to proceeding with these negotiations now. We feel confident we will succeed in getting that authority. Despite the compelling benefits TTIP will bring, it has triggered a wave of criticism, often about peripheral issues, and in a manner that amounts to scaremongering. To those who are skeptical about this agreement and who refuse to believe the assurances provided by both sides, I would simply say this: we are still in a relatively early stage of these negotiations. Do not prejudge the results. Wait until we have advanced texts before you make up your mind. One of the myths that these negotiations are being conducted in secret. As Vital Moreira, the former head of this committee, and Commissioner de Gucht have said, there has never been a less secretive trade negotiation. Just as we are spending a significant amount of time with our Congress and our advisory groups, so is the Commission spending a lot of time with you and your own advisory groups. And as the Commissioner pointed out to this committee a short time ago, it is rather difficult for us to convince it's rather difficult to convince us, that we should provide you with more access to negotiating texts than we provide our own members of Congress. We grant them and their designated staff members the opportunity to read our proposals and consolidated texts. There is an enormous amount of publicly available information, as well as information released in hundreds of briefings, speeches, consultations that each side is conducting with its legislatures, businesses, and a very broad range of civil society through many advisory committees. While we are in favor of transparency, we also believe that it has to be balanced against other objectives. Anyone who has negotiated complex international agreements, or any deal for that matter, and I have negotiated, I can say hundreds, knows that total transparency with third parties makes honest dialogue and compromise almost impossible. Another persistent myth is that TTIP is about promoting a deregulatory agenda. And this is assurances by the President of the United States, the President of the European Commission, and many political leaders and senior negotiators on both sides of the Atlantic that nothing we will do in TTIP will in any way limit the ability of our governments to regulate in the public interest or reduce the level of health, safety, and environmental protections. No, TTIP will not force European countries to privatize public services. No, it will not serve to exclude these services. TTIP will not force them to privatize public services such as public health care, education, or utilities. These services are excluded from our General Agreement on Trade and Services and our own free trade agreements. A related myth is that U.S. standards are lower than those in Europe. That ignores the fact that many U.S. standards are in fact more restrictive than those in Europe, and it ignores the fact that millions of European visitors to the United States are happy to eat our food and to drive our cars. Our people, our government, and our Congress respect the health and safety of American consumers, and value the right to regulate appropriately as much as you do. We don't want to force European consumers to eat food that they reject. Rather, we want Europe to follow the advice of its own food safety authority and to give European consumers a choice rather than to persistently pervert science-based decision-making for political ends. As a former lawyer, I have a particular interest in the debate concerning investor-state dispute settlement, an issue that is frequently misunderstood. Now, you in this committee know that EU member states have signed about 1,400 bilateral investment treaties, nearly all of which contain ISDS provisions. Despite frequent claims to the contrary, we are not seeking to grant businesses the right to claim compensation for an alleged loss of investment value. We believe it is vital to have an appropriate balance between the protection of investment and the right of governments to regulate. We consulted extensively with our stakeholders to achieve such a balance in our own model bilateral investment treaty, and we welcome the Commission's consultation. Look forward to their next steps. My final point is that both sides should focus on pragmatic, practical positions if we are to reach an agreement that promotes the interests of people in both Europe and the United States. We can get a good deal for both sides, but only if we stay focused, respect the facts, and keep an open mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Ambassador. So I will now open the floor, and Ms. Redding is the first. She's a member of the EPP, and the EPP is the biggest group, and in the order of the...
So she's the first EPP...
Yeah, exactly.
The first EPP one. No more EPP ones until it's gone through.
Thank you, President, and thank you for your presence, Ambassador. I heard with great interest that Attorney General Eric Holder seeks congressional legislation decision to extend the rules of the US Privacy Act also to EU citizens. That is good news. I hope that the Congress will agree with the American government on this. I would like just to concentrate on one question. We have many questions to discuss when we speak about TTIP and our relations. Everybody knows that the mutual trust has been broken between the two parts of the Atlantic by non-compliance of American private companies operating on the European market with the data protection rules, and the non-compliance of American public authorities with the transatlantic agreements in the same field. And we have been, since months now, trying to restore this trust. And we also know that data protection is the elephant in the room when we speak about TTIP. Therefore, I have three very concrete questions. First, do the American counterparts accept the 13 recommendations which were made last November in view to make safe harbour safe? Second, do our American counterparts agree to leave data protection out of TTIP in order not to make things even more difficult than they are now? And third, do the American counterparts agree to withdraw the requests which have been issued on the 25th of April this year, requests in the TISA negotiations for the free flow of data internationally without any control or safeguard for the protection of individuals?
Thanks a lot. David.
Thank you. Can I also add my welcome to the Ambassador, and I hope we do have a long and fruitful relationship. I think firstly, though, I have to say to the Ambassador, he said he had been a trade negotiator for a long, long time and involved in trade issues for a long, long time. I think he has to grasp that the situation has changed in terms of trade negotiations. It's 10 years ago, and I've also been involved in trade for a long time, most trade deals were done behind closed doors. There was very little public interest in them, and maybe to the shame of this Parliament, very little political scrutiny of trade deals until they were actually concluded. The situation has changed, and trade deals are now being monitored much more closely. And I'm afraid he will have to get used to the fact that we are going to pick on every item by item and scrutinise it to see what impact it's going to have on our voters and on our constituents. Now, it's a nice debating point to compare chlorinated chicken to the situation in Ukraine, but the fact is trade deals are about these nitty-gritty issues, and whatever the scientific evidence says, there are many Europeans who don't want chlorinated chicken coming to Europe. There are many Europeans who don't want GMOs in Europe. There are trade unionists who legitimately believe that the health services that they value could be threatened by a TTIP. It's up to us not just to dismiss that as a myth or a scare story, but to actually explain why, if they're not going to be threatened, they're not going to be threatened. Similarly with workers' rights. Again, it may be absolutely right that TTIP will not impact on workers' rights, but we have to explain why it will not impact on workers' rights. On investor-state dispute, I'm afraid I disagree with the Ambassador. I think he's being far too dismissive of concerns about investor-state dispute. It clearly has enhanced corporate power, and it's the fact we do have 1,400 bilateral investment treaties in existence that raises the concerns about expanding investor-state dispute, because some of those 1,400 have cost governments significant sums of money, have impacted on public policy development, and so we cannot just say, oh, we already have investor-state disputes, so it's not a problem. The reason we know it's a problem is because of the existing agreements. So I have made it very clear in the past, I want TTIP. I agree with the Ambassador that a good TTIP is good for both our economies. I've also said very clearly in this committee and in the plenary that I will judge TTIP at the end of the day, not on what might come out of it. But equally, I think the negotiators have a duty to listen to the concerns that the politicians, the public and the unions and the NGOs are putting forward to make sure that our concerns are not in that final agreement and that they are taken account of as we go through the process.
Thanks a lot. Emma.
Thank you, and thank you, Ambassador, for your comments, which are very much welcomed by my group, the ECR, and especially your commitment to TTIP and delivering for our citizens. That has to be absolutely what we focus on. Particularly, I agree with you that we need to have an accurate interpretation of what is happening during the negotiations on both sides, and there are a lot of myths flying around. I would like to ask you specifically about what's happening in DC and events that are happening on the Hill regarding the Trade Promotion Authority, which can expedite negotiations from the US point of view. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that being passed following the midterm elections. And again, should the Republicans then take over the Senate in November, as many are predicting, how would that impact on the negotiations as well?
Thanks, Mrs. Schake.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your introductory words. It's a bit of a shame you didn't speak Dutch, but you know. Your directness approached our style quite well. I think it's good that you appreciate the importance of this House and that you look forward to better relations with the European Parliament. I also welcome your words on your commitment to restoring the trust in the transatlantic relation. It is much needed. And I too believe that transparency was one of the promises of President Obama, and that also may need some reminding sometimes. I appreciated the fact that you focused on the global perspective that we need. But I also believe that our actions in the world should be based on our core values. And I think that those are very deeply felt here in Europe, and that they are not a matter of pragmatism, but rather really touching upon our fundamental rights. And I'm not sure that is understood or seen in the United States at all times. I think we have very hard work ahead of us in this committee with regard to TTIP. Let's not make it a game of chicken, but let's really work together to make it comprehensive, I agree, and to finish it. When it all started, Vice President Biden would often talk about finishing the ride on one tank of gas. And while we've speculated what kind of fuel we are using, you know, perhaps a very ecological, efficient one, I think it is now time, especially on the American side, to step on the gas. Because with regard to some developments like Trade Promotion Authority, we are not seeing the commitment and the sense of urgency that we would like to see. And I'll end by saying that I hope your outreach will also go to members of Congress. I was, and I'm still, a member of the U.S. delegation. I've been to the Congress many times where there's a significantly less ambitious appearance of members of Congress in meeting with us. And I think we're at a crucial point with TTIP and with how this is going to take shape in moving on, where we need more commitment from the House of Representatives and the Senate as representatives of our respective citizens and small and medium-sized enterprises to make TTIP work. And so I encourage you to send that message to Washington loudly and clearly, as you are able to do. We've just heard. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Jean-Nic.
Merci, merci.
Thank you, Ambassador. You said some nice words about the Europeans in your introduction. I just finished season 2 of House of Cards yesterday. Frank Rode is president, and so I welcome the European cultural exception, and I hope there will be another series. I would like to know what your opinion is as an American ambassador about the fact that a certain number of European countries are selling arms to Russia. The 2 French Mistral ships, that is part of international trade. So there's that link between trade and geopolitics and our security, which you talked about at the beginning of your speech. On the transatlantic treaty, I could almost repeat word for word what David Martin said, but I would reach a different conclusion. Expressing the same reservations, I would reach the conclusion that we shouldn't negotiate this treaty today. There are very ambitious and I think biased estimations of the growth that this would produce by 2027, but I don't think that we can wait till 2027 to create economic growth. You mentioned transparency. And there, I think, given your knowledge of European countries, it should perhaps give you pause for thought and make you adopt a more nuanced position on this. Do you realize that the Italian Vice Minister for Trade, who is responsible for presiding the Council of Trade Ministers at the moment, cannot get these documents? He doesn't have access to these documents in his office. Now, how do you view this, given the fact that we are told all the time that it is one of the U.S. demands? It seems that the U.S. is treating the Europeans like Boy Scouts here. You didn't mention the fact that the trade agreement is a top priority. You said it was, but nonetheless, there does seem to be quite some misgivings about this in American civil society and within the Congress as well. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And then finally, on the US side, if we are consistently told that public contracts are a competence of the federal level, and you have used that to develop your economy, and that there are a certain number of rules and regulations on financial services that you are not going to give up, but because you feel that this protects you against financial crises. On the European side, we hear, as David Martin has just said, that the precautionary principle is an important principle, and that we are not going to go along with a line of argumentation that if a scientific fact is not 100% proven, that it is something that which can be politically manipulated. If you look then also at the ISDS, I wonder, are you going to continue, if you continue to come along and talk to us about that, if those elements are going to be taken out of the discussion? Helmut, but before we take Helmut, I would just make the point that we have 8 further speakers on the list, and I'm closing the speakers list. Helmut.
Thank you to the Ambassador for the comprehensive acknowledgement of us about his European awareness. And that leads me to the question or to the remark that transparency, yes, I agree also with you that it is one of the key points of these negotiations. And why are there a lot of fears of discussions in all member states of the European Union? Because it is not clear what is really negotiated yet, because the mandate was not published. So from the very beginning, it was the beginning already the biggest mistake made, because everybody understands that if we are negotiating economic ties, questions of trade, then it concerns the question of production and of consumption, the way of how we live today. So these negotiations are in the focus of all citizens in the member states. And maybe that's why in Europe is a broader debate on these issues than in the United States. But I see that also in the United States there's a growing discussion in the civil society related to these negotiations. So the question is, what is really in the focus of the negotiations? And if I'm, as a member of the Trade Committee of this House, having the right to go to the reading room, which is now established, and I see that there is, despite certain remarks by the Commission that ISDS, for example, is not negotiated any longer because there was a consultation period, and that we have to wait till November when we have taken into consideration the outcome of this consultation, then I see there that nevertheless it is continued to be negotiated. So, and in this atmosphere, the negotiations are in the focus of the public. So the problem which really is how we manage it, that what is negotiated is also brought to the citizens who will be affected by the outcome of the negotiation, the one or the other way. Second question, I very much appreciate the questions of Mrs. Reding concerning the data protections. Only data, because data are also in the understanding of trade logics being a product. So in the audiovisual sector, which is excluded, it comes via the television and audio and radio programs, etc. Again on the agenda, because the data are today part of the digital agenda. So the question is if the digital agenda on these issues is continue to be negotiated or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dartmouth.
Thank you very much. First of all, I shall be very brief. First of all, may I perhaps congratulate the Ambassador on the eloquence, clarity and precision of his opening remarks. Would that all our colleagues were capable of the same. The views of the State Department on the European project are, of course, well known and well established, but perhaps the Ambassador will not think it impertinent if I just simply say that the views of ex-commissioners are not the only views on the European project represented in this Parliament, and not the only views on the European project represented on this committee and in this room. Just very quickly on TTIP. There is already a huge controversy on this in the United Kingdom, and particularly focused on ISDS, the investor-to-state dispute settlement. Now, you heard from David Martin a rather measured reservations on ISDS. Well, in England, in the UK and indeed in other countries, there are many. England, exactly. Perhaps I'm anticipating something. Perhaps I'm anticipating something. In the UK, there are many less measured reservations about ISDS being put forward. And as someone who's very pro-American, I was partly educated there. I lived there for 8 years of my adult life, and I have the honour to have an entire Ivy League college named after my family. I would just say to the Ambassador, I hope he wouldn't regard it as impertinent, that the United States government needs to do more to explain ISDS in order to get this thing passed. And finally, the Ambassador was very, very clear that we're a long way off finalised texts, let alone finalised agreements. And you can be absolutely assured that my party will delay and defer making any judgment on TTIP until such time as there is something approaching a final text published for us to consider.
Thanks a lot. Herr Waleser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your kind words about my father. I have 3 questions regarding the TTIP. First, I would like to ask you about the American offer concerning tariffs on goods. As we know, it was not very ambitious. So can we expect a new one, or would you like, or would you prefer the EU to decrease its level of ambition of its own tariff offer? And if we can expect a new tariff offer, can we expect it before the midterm elections in November? That's my first question. Second question, so far, the United States has not responded to the EU request to have a separate chapter on energy. Do you intend to respond, and if so, when? And finally, you mentioned the Trade Promotion Authority. Did I understood you correctly? President Obama will not try to obtain it from the Congress?
I don't think so. Thanks a lot. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would like to compliment the Ambassador on his clear, transparent and indeed honest presentation of the position regarding TTIP in his viewpoint. Just a few questions. One, I was pleased to hear him refer to data protection. Being involved in that as a rapporteur, it was something that has caused a lot of worry here in Europe, and Mrs. Reding has asked questions. No need for me to go over them, but I will be interested in the response. Number 2, there's a lot of talk about transparency, and sometimes transparency can lead to misinterpretation. And I think that we have a situation where people are maybe intentionally, others not so, are making up their minds against TTIP without having the full facts. As Emma McClarkin said, there are a lot of myths flying around, and is there need for greater explanation to come from the negotiators as a PR exercise so that people can see what is actually true as opposed to myth? And I think that's an important point because public opinion is being whipped up. And finally, just in relation to the one tank of gas, is it the intention or the hope of the US administration that that tank of gas would coincide with the ending of President Obama's reign as president, and that we will get TTIP done and dusted by then? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Herr Rehn.
Thank you, Ambassador. First of all, I agree with you that the TTIP has substantial economic potential for growth and jobs in Europe and in the US, and it's clear that Europe has to search for growth also beyond our borders. And also TTIP has significant strategic potential at the current critical context of a security crisis in Europe, in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, we can only win the case by convincing our citizens that the fears related to issues like ISDS can be clarified, and they will not pose obstacle to this. Now, you call for pragmatism in the negotiations and for a solution-oriented approach, and on that I can also in principle agree with you. You referred to chlorine chicken. How about then Buy American provisions and the de facto hidden or creeping protectionism in the US itself? Are you ready to open public procurement for SMEs, which are the backbone of employment on both sides of the Atlantic? And are you ready to reconsider the Jones Act, which under the grounds of national security provisions are effectively working as protectionist measures in your single market in the US?
Thanks a lot. Madame Sahi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. I'm not going to go into the question of transparency, but because you will have understood that here this is a top priority, and I really must ask you to make an effort to explain things, because you see that the lack of transparency is giving rise to people's imagination and allowing that to be politically exploited. On ISDS, I won't turn to that, but I would like to express my greatest reservations about that mechanism. I just wanted to put two brief questions about the negotiating mandate. We have understood that Barack Obama will not obtain a negotiating mandate from the Congress, but after the November elections, perhaps things might be different. Can you tell us about that? And another question, it seems that at present American EU negotiations cannot agree on the inclusion of geographic indications in the agreement, and that there is still a standstill on that. Can you tell us more? Thank you. Madame Le Pen. Ambassador, congratulations for your display of languages. That was very impressive. You raised the question of transparency. I'm a lawyer. It's easier to visit a prisoner in a prison than to consult the TTIP, but we have got a right to consult the TTIP, but we cannot even take in a pen. And we are allowed to be drowned in an ocean of documents, as if people were afraid of that we might notice what really is at stake in the negotiations. And I'd just like to know whether American members of Congress had access to the negotiating mandate, whether they've kept informed about the development of negotiations on TTIP, or is there the same disdain for the people and for democracy in the USA as in Europe? That's my first question. The second is on agriculture. Well, American farms are a lot larger and often more productive than European ones, and agricultural duties will be done away with under the new agreement, and the production standards in Europe and America should be as close as possible, when we know that American agriculture uses processes which the French and many Europeans absolutely reject. I'm sorry about that, but they're the ones who decide in our countries. European agriculture, particularly French agriculture, runs the risk of suffering considerably from that competition with the very industrialised American agriculture. The quality of agriculture will not be what the French and other Europeans want. They'll be obliged to level down to American standards. We are opposed to this conflict between American and European agriculture. We believe that this will undermine the right to self-sufficiency, and each people has the right to choose what it wants to eat, and that's the choice of society. So, Ambassador, is it in our interest to impose upon our respective peoples choices which they don't want? And doesn't that run the risk of making us even further away from one another rather than bringing us closer together? Thank you. Mrs. Rodriguez, to conclude. Thank you, Chairman. I too would like to express a welcome to the American ambassador and congratulate him on marrying a Spaniard. I'd like to say, first of all, that I too recognise the opportunities provided by the TTIP agreement to improve growth, employment and other opportunities for competitiveness, but not any old TTIP. You said in your statement something which I think is completely common sense and which I support. You said that we should not anticipate upon the results of an agreement which is in the middle of a the process at the moment. That's true, but I must admit that there already are prejudices because there has been a lack of trust, there's a lack of confidence, a lack of information. And if we want to overcome these prejudices, if we want to provide adequate information, we need to correct people's mistaken impressions. And there are two questions I'm concerned about, and I wonder if you could clarify them now. First of all, you referred to the fact that the level of information to members of parliament, members of Congress in America should be similar to the ones we have here. But the thing is, do we really have the same level of information? Because European members of parliament so far are not satisfied about the level of information. And I really don't know about the position of the American members of Congress, but I think that this is a problem which needs to be tackled. And secondly, I'd also like to know your opinion regarding the treatment of ISDS. When the Italian Vice Minister appeared, he said that the position of the USA and in the agreement with Canada, CETA, their position is inadequate. I'd like to know whether that is true, why he would think it's inadequate, why we have such different positions. And I wonder how we can move closer there.
Thanks a lot. Ambassador Gardner, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll try to be brief. Those were all very... I don't know how many questions there were, but it covers just about the entire waterfront of the key issues that we have in front of us. But let me start with the question that Commissioner Reding asked. It's very important, and I'm actually personally involved in both the Safe Harbor and the DPPA, so-called umbrella agreement for the exchange of data between law enforcement authorities. And I'm personally involved in looking at the texts of what we're negotiating because it is such an important issue, as you rightly stated. My understanding about the state of these negotiations is that we are pretty close. So you mentioned 13 recommendations that came out of the paper last year of the Commission. 11 of them, as you very well know, were commercially focused recommendations, and I think we're there. I think we're very, very close. We're just talking about words, or a few words. Of course, the last two are the recommendations that relate to the national security exemption, and I understand the sensitivities here that exemption not be used as a whole. And I think using your words shouldn't be used as a hoover. It should be used as a true limited exemption. And you, Commissioner Reding, suggested a mosaic approach, which I think is the right approach. We've accepted that approach. We're working on a text that will describe the existing limitations under our own law that limits the way that this data for foreign intelligence purposes can be gathered. It's true we've been somewhat delayed. And we've been somewhat delayed, not out of bad faith, but because we have some internal issues that relate to the fact that an important report was delivered to the White House. It has not been cleared, and some of what we can say publicly in this mosaic approach will depend on whether that report has been cleared by the White House. But again, we are very close, and I'm confident that we can respond in a substantive way to the request that was made for a mosaic approach relating to the last two recommendations. And I will continue to work on these two negotiations. As for your question relating to the Trade and Services Agreement, if you'll permit me, I'll get back to you on that point because I don't know the answer. So I will inform myself and get back to you. With regard to the point I think that Mr. Martin raised, I think I may have been misunderstood. I agree completely with your point that today is not the same as 10 years ago. The demands for transparency has certainly increased, and that's why I would argue specifically, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, these negotiations are more transparent than negotiations 10 years ago, even a few years ago. We specifically recognize that fact. We have increased the amount of consultations we've undertaken in these negotiations. We've created a new number of advisory groups. And I think that both sides, the Commission and we, would argue that the level of consultations and briefings that are occurring now are unprecedented. So I think we're in agreement on this point, and I didn't mean to diminish the importance of transparency. Look, on ISDS, clearly we are in disagreement here, and all I can say, because as a former lawyer, I love this subject. You know, I actually knew about ISDS a long, long time ago when only a few dozen people knew about the existence of ISDS. I would just urge those of you who are skeptics about this, to the extent you have not already done so, please consult the model bilateral investment treaty that we have issued after years of consultation with our stakeholders, which respond to a lot of the concerns that you are expressing. For example, the concerns that were expressed about ISDS are that it interferes with businesses' expectation of making a profit. It is not true. In order to make a claim under a model BIT and other ISDS provisions, you have to prove much more. You have to prove discrimination. You have to prove expropriation. You have to prove interference with judicial due process. The barriers are high. I would just tell those of you who are skeptics, and I keep on hearing references to the same cases being raised, Vattenfall in Sweden, the Lone Pine Tree case in Canada, the Philip Morris case. It's always the same cases that are being discussed. And you know what? Never do people refer to the fact that those cases are cases that have been filed. Those are not cases that have been decided. We do not know how those cases will be decided. So let's just please be patient and see how the arbitral tribunals will rule. Our U.S. model BIT has provisions in there that deter frivolous claims. It has provisions in there that provide governments the opportunity to give detailed guidance on the interpretation of the obligations that are most frequently litigated. They provide a statute of limitations provision that limits the time period with which investors can bring ISDS claims. They provide provisions that allow non-parties such as civil society organizations to make their own submissions. A lot of the claims on ISDS are highly, highly misleading. And I often hear the claim that these provisions chill a sovereign government's right to legislate. I don't believe that's the case. If you look at the record that's in the reports that have been done last decade of ISDS, the UN Conference on Trade and Development has a complete record of ISDS, and it will show that, in fact, more cases have been dismissed than have been won. Of those cases that have been won by businesses, they have not succeeded in getting anywhere close to the damage awards that they have wanted. And finally, I would say to those of you who believe in environmental protection, there are a lot of greens in the room, you know, this is not just a tool for big business to undermine health, safety, environmental protections. I just referred to you that there's 6 ISDS cases pending before Spain. Why? Because Spain had passed legislation that encouraged investors in renewable energy to build solar plants and other facilities. And guess what? The Spanish government decided that they would revoke those feed-in tariff laws that encouraged investors to come into Spain to build those plants. Now I'm asking those who are skeptics of this room, do you think it was wrong for the investors to say that's not right? You can't retroactively eliminate the feed-in tariffs that brought us here and to build those plants. They have lost hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is not just a tool for big business. But I've spoken too much on ISDS. I'd be happy to sit down with anyone in this room who is a skeptic about this mechanism. On TPA, I think, Emma, you mentioned TPA. All I can say is that we are confident we're going to get this done. Negotiations obviously have been continuing. And I would say this is not the first time in history whereby we're advancing on several trade negotiation fronts and we don't yet have trade promotion authority. So this is not an unusual state of affairs. You don't have to believe my word for it. I've spoken to a number of people who have piloted through Congress prior trade agreements, who are heads of international business bodies. And they tell me very confidently the votes are there. Just get a good agreement and the votes will be there. And I believe them. When we're going to get this done, I can't tell you, but certainly we believe still today we can get this deal done by the end of next year. Yes, I've heard there was a discussion about the Mistral, I think you're being referring to. Look, we've made clear our views, and not only us, by the way, more importantly, other European countries have made clear their views, but the French government has also very strong views about this sale, and I have nothing more to add about that. We understand that if it were cancelled, significant penalties would have to be paid. But our view remains that it's an unfortunate sale at this time, given what's happening in the world. You mentioned that the projections for growth from TTIP are too ambitious. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But my answer to you is, so what? My answer is, Europe needs growth. It needs jobs. And one thing we are sure is that this agreement will create growth and it will create jobs. Are we really in a position to say 0.5% GDP growth is not good enough, or it will take too much time for us to reach that level? I don't think we have the luxury to make that kind of argument. We need every lever of growth today, because there aren't many available. There aren't many debt-free stimulus levers available. Maybe it's the digital agenda. Maybe it's labor market reform. You might disagree with me on that one. But one thing is for sure, TTIP is one of the most significant levers for growth available. Transparency, I know, cuts across many of the comments that have been made. And I already mentioned my response to Mr. Martin. We cannot provide a higher degree of transparency in this negotiation than we provide our own members of Congress. Yes, they are happy with the transparency we give them. Someone else mentioned this. They have access, and their staff members do have access to our negotiating texts. We simply can't do more, and I'm not sure how to take forward, how to be more responsive to the clear concerns that have been expressed by this body. So I'm afraid I don't know what more can be provided. I would simply add to this. Make sure, those of you who are skeptics about transparency, that you actually go onto the websites before you judge that we are we're not being transparent. There is an enormous amount of information. The negotiating mandate, which has been referred to, is in our website. It's in the high-level working group report to Congress. It's all there. There's nothing secret. There's nothing pernicious in in the fact that we are limiting the number of reading rooms. You can know everything you want about what we're trying to achieve. In terms of public procurement, I would simply say that there's a bit of mythology as well about public procurement in the United States. Yes, we have Buy America, but the degree of openness in Europe and the United States is roughly similar. 320 billion is the degree of market access that both sides provide in federal and sub-federal procurement. Demands to repeal Buy America are, let's face it, counterproductive. They're just not going to move these negotiations forward. What we're asking the Europeans to do is to be specific about where their commercial interests lie. Once we get a specific list of concerns and demands, we can sit down and actually determine whether we can respond to them. And yes, we are working with our states, because in our constitutional system, as you know, the federal government can't mandate our U.S. states about how they spend their tax dollars. But what we can do is to work with them, as we did in the WTO, and to say, are you willing to expand the commitments, the undertakings you made? And in order to do that, I would suggest the best way to convince a governor or a state legislator that they should participate in these negotiations is to lay out for them the benefits and the opportunities that their states would gain. Tariffs on goods. May I just respond to Yaroslav, your point about tariffs on goods. Our position remains. We tabled an offer, as you know. It was considered to be too low. So you're nodding your head. It's not the end of the discussion. We have repeated we want to see a full elimination of tariffs on goods. That remains our position, and our discussions with the Commission about when and whether we're going to improve our our offer. We do intend to improve our offer, but when is still open to question. Separate chapter on energy. It's still an open question about whether it's necessary or whether we can include energy-related topics within other chapters. I fully appreciate the reason you're asking that question. It is an important issue. Particularly, I suppose you have in mind the export of natural gas. Given the geopolitical context, it is important. But as you also know, I'm sure, Yaroslav, we already have covered under conditional or agreements from the Department of Energy export licenses for 93 billion cubic meters of gas, which covers a very large percentage of Europe's current imports of natural gas. But I agree that the symbolism of noting that under a free trade agreement, the permission of the Department of Energy would be automatic is important. So if the TTIP is signed and we have a free trade agreement in place, requests for further permits to export natural gas would be automatic. I think I already mentioned about 1 tank of gas. We still hope to get this deal done by the end of next year. And I think I discussed the Buy America provisions. It's important. It's part of our ongoing discussions. On GIs, which was discussed at the end, we have a different system of protecting intellectual property in the United States. This has not been an obstacle, by the way, for European exporters of food products to capture greater market share in the United States. You know that Europe has a surplus of $6 billion in its agricultural trade with the United States, and it's growing. The fact that we protect food names through our trademark system and more through trademarks than through geographical indications has not been an obstacle to increasing exports from Europe. And I would simply say as well, our view is that in certain cases, Europeans have exaggerated their demands in terms of geographical indications because they cover names that we consider to be either generic or semi-generic. And there are many examples I'd be happy to discuss with you, from Parmesan cheese, which the Europeans say is somehow confusing with Parmigiano Reggiano, which I don't think is the case. It covers other forms of cheeses, meats, and wines. There was a discussion about, large agricultural farms from Marine Le Pen. How on earth can Europe compete with those large factories? But it's a myth. Not all our farms are big factories that are going to swamp Europe with cheap and not high-quality produce. There are farms of all kinds in the United States. And we also have small and medium-sized farms. And all I would tell you, the American consumers are becoming more sophisticated. There is room in our market for all sorts of products, for the cheap and perhaps the less high quality, and for also higher quality and expensive foods imported from Europe. And I think it is a myth that somehow, Europe can't compete and American consumers don't want or don't appreciate high quality European products that come from a specific territory, that are branded in a specific way and are made with specific ingredients. I agree, it's a choice of consumers about what foods they want to eat. But let's not have politicians make that decision for them on political grounds. It's interesting, there's some member states in Europe who 100% of the time vote against the scientific advice of the European Food Safety Authority. 100% of the time. Why? And by the way, they don't have to say why they disagree with EFSA. They just say they disagree. I would love to see those countries who disagree say on scientific grounds why they disagree with EFSA, why they disagree with the European Association of National Science Federations. And the reason they can't do that is it's not based on science. It's based purely on politics. And that's the problem that we have today. There was finally a question about ISDS and CETA. To be honest with you, I haven't been through those provisions in CETA, so I cannot respond. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here today. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about these and many other issues for many, many months. And as I said it in my opening statement, my door is always open. Honest, transparent dialogue is what I hope we'll have.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm sure that we'll have a further opportunity to discuss, perhaps also to discuss ISDS and CETA and the consequences for TTIP. Thanks a lot again, and we stay in contact. Colleagues, please leave the room. Only the coordinators should stay here. Now we have the coordinators meeting, and that's a meeting in camera, so everybody has to leave the room.